So there's two ways that business leaders use finance. One that feels efficient and one that actually changes performance. But most business leaders don't know which they're in until something actually breaks. And in this video, we'll talk about the two models of finance, where every business should eventually end up, and how each business should get there. So for those of you who don't know me, I'm Brett. I've been leading finance teams at some of the largest and fastest growing companies in the world for over a decade. So let's talk about type one of finance, which is what I call it. I call it finance as a service provider. So at the end of the day, finance is a cost center, right? A lot of finance folks don't like that I say this, but truly finance is a back office function that does not generate revenue. We don't sell anything and we don't add any direct value to the business, right? We're an operating expense at the end of the day. And many businesses start by viewing finance in this way, which is actually correct in my opinion. And this might look like you have a bookkeeper, an accountant, or even a controller who's doing the routine finance work that's required to keep you compliant. So think about payroll, bookkeeping. That might be HR, might be finance, might be this quasi sort of finance, admin, HR role. They might even be giving you reporting or providing you a little bit of advice when the reporting comes out. In this stage with finance as a service provider, they're likely not driving meaningful difference in the business beyond just that. So here's some characteristics of that kind of a finance team, just so you can identify if you're in this stage. Again, this is not right or wrong. This is just what it is. So finance tends to be downstream of decisions if they're a service provider. So you make a decision as the owner, executive, founder, and you pass that decision down to finance to execute on. Outputs are requested of finance, not co-created. So finance isn't bringing their own thoughts or playbook. You as the owner or founder are asking them for something. And then third, timelines are dictated by leadership. So you're telling them when you want or need something. This model works really well under certain circumstances. Here's what I've seen it work well in. One, you're a strong leader. And most founders and business owners are strong leaders, especially early on in the company's history. Number two, you've got weak or untrusted finance. So maybe you hired somebody that you don't know, or you don't really want to give them full access to everything. You don't want them in the room making business decisions. There's no reason they would be in the room. You just don't trust them. So they're not in the room. And then when simplicity matters, or you're trying to save money, frankly, like you can hire a bookkeeper for under $1,000 a month, especially if you go offshore. It could be under $500 a month. You get quality bookkeeping, you get quality administrative support at that level. That's fine. Just don't expect advisory level services for that price. And that's okay. And early on in a business history, you want simplicity. You want to save a few bucks. And that's important. So now let's talk about the type two of finance, what I call finance as a strategic partner. So the first type was finance as a service provider. Now we're finance as a strategic partner. So full transparency, this is what I've seen at some of the largest and fastest growing companies and most successful companies that I've worked at. So it's not 100% across leadership groups. So you'll find pockets even within some of those large businesses where they don't treat finance as a strategic partner, but almost unanimously from a high level perspective, you're talking about Fortune 100 companies, you're talking about private equity backed, even venture backed. Once they're a little bit more mature, they're going to have finance as a strategic partner in the room. Why? Because the business has become so complex that there needs to be an objective layer of what I call scorekeeping and then driving the business that sits between the CEO, the owner, the founder, and the rest of the business. So here's what you see within this model from a finance perspective. Finance has a seat at the table, and often finance is the number two. So the CFO is often the number two to the owner, founder, or CEO. Number two, finance owns the uncomfortable decisions. Finance is the first to step in and help sort that out before it ever gets to the CEO or the owner. Number three, finance frames the trade-offs. So as the business is deciding what to do, should we prioritize profit? Should we prioritize growth? Should we prioritize margin, saving money? Finance will help to frame that so the business can make an intelligent decision for the long-term strategy and health of the business. And number four, and this is maybe one of the more important ones, is finance drives the operating cadence. So early on, when finance is a cost center, the owner is driving the operating cadence. The owner is deciding everything, when everything gets done. But as the business matures, what you'll find is that finance is actually driving it. They're setting up the meetings. They're deciding when things are due, when things are owed back to them. So they're creating that cadence, whereas the owner can be removed of that. And so what this does is it creates this interesting role split between what I call the CEO or the founder, as well as finance. So the CEO or the founder is working on what we should be working on and why we should be working on it. But finance is focused now on the how and the trade-offs. The finance is really driving the how with the rest of the business leaders. So now that we understand the two types of finance that we're going to find within a business, let's talk about how to make the transition between one and two. Because what I mentioned earlier is true. Every business eventually makes the leap. But knowing when to make that leap is just as critical as knowing that you should, at some point, make the leap if you want to be a high-performing business. And I'm just going to draw from my personal experience of over a decade in finance leadership, and I'll tell you what I typically see as far as the timing of when to make that leap. So first, within a business, the founder is doing everything. Founders, they've got their hands in everything. The founder starts to hire more senior level people. Maybe it's directors, maybe it's heads, maybe it's chief level positions. So the team grows. When you hire that level of person, what you do is you impart to them a level of accountability to drive their own results. So if you hire a head of sales or a director of sales, what you're going to do is you're going to give them goals and targets, and you're going to back up. If you do that enough times, what you find is that you've got accountability spread throughout the organization, and the owner is then removed from that accountability. So who's holding all of them accountable? Well, it could be the owner, but at some point, the founder or the owner will hit its breaking point. They won't be able to drive the accountability within the entire organization. They could, but the founder should be working on higher leverage activities than simply holding people accountable and making sure they're hitting their goals and things like that. That's the breaking point. And that's actually where finance tends to step in and move from a service provider to a strategic partner. So what finance will do first is usually set up a monthly operating rhythm. So this is when reports come out. This is when due dates are. This is when the business owes their updates back to the owner. Finance will usually facilitate this, whether it's a PowerPoint deck or an Excel file or whatever it is. It could be simple, it could be complex, a dashboard, but finance will install this operating rhythm of when things are due every single month. So the owner can know exactly when they're going to get an update on things without stressing about it or having to do it themselves. Number two is finance will start to provide cash visibility. So instead of the owner just checking their bank account, what finance can do is actually check the bank account and then project the bank account. So we call that cash flow modeling. So that's where finance can actually understand the timing of payments, inflows, and outflows, and then start to project out when the cash is coming in and out and make sure that the business doesn't run out of cash and is solvent, right? That's like the number one thing that puts businesses out of business is they just simply run out of cash. The third thing that finance is going to do when they step in after that breaking point is connecting the business activities to future financial performance. So this one's key. Again, if you're going to remove yourself as an owner from the business, you're going to impart accountability to the business leaders. This is where finance can actually plug that gap. Finance can be along for the ride with the business. Understand exactly what's happening with maybe it's sales, maybe it's marketing activities, maybe it's product rollouts, things like that, and connect it back to the full-blown financial model and then project that financial model out into the future. The fourth thing that finance is going to do is it's going to drive accountability for performance. So we talked about this with the monthly operating rhythm, but truly finance is going to start asking the tough questions, which should allow the owner to not have to ask the tough questions on a daily basis. Finance can do that as an objective third party. And then the last thing that finance is going to do is it's going to filter decisions. So think about all of those different trade-offs that you have to make within a business. Instead of somebody framing the decision how they want to frame it, finance can step in as an objective third party and sense that they're sort of framing it that way and sort of counteract it and say, but what about a different solution? Or what if we save the money instead? Or what are we really getting for this? What's the ROI? What's the cost benefit here? That's what finance really flourishes in. So we've talked about the two different types of finance partners, whether it's a service provider or a strategic partner. We've talked about when that breaking point happens. Now let's talk about how to make that leap. So if you're in sort of part one, which is finance as a service provider, and you want to make the leap to finance as a strategic partner, there's two main ways that you can do that. The first is you just rely on your internal accounting team, whether it's your bookkeeper, your accountant, your controller, and you do two things with them. One, you invite them into the decisions. So remember earlier I talked about how as a service provider, finance is often downstream of decisions. So you're making decisions and you're handing it to them. Invite your accountant into the room. Invite your controller into the room. Ask them to weigh in on decisions before you make them. You're effectively elevating them into a CFO role, right? The reason why you would do this is because they already have access to all your financials. They sort of know your business. You're just asking them to think a little bit differently, and you're asking their wheels to turn in a different way than they've ever done. Now, Some accountants are great at this and they will step into this role gracefully. Some just don't have that bone in their body to think about the business in that way. And that's okay, but this is a really easy way to test. So you invite them into the room and you invite them into making those decisions with you. The next thing that you will do is you will ask them to advise you on 5 core pillars of finance. So what are those 5 core pillars of finance? Your cash flow, your margins, your decision confidence. So think of things like scenario modeling. Should we do this? Should we do that? The 4th thing is forecasting and financial modeling. So can they build a financial model for you? And then the 5th thing is your enterprise value. Or if you're trying to exit or raise funds, asking them to step into that space and help you understand your enterprise value, what would maximize it or improve it, or improve your exit or improve your ability to raise funds. So those are the 5 pillars that you're going to ask your accountant or controller to step into. Now, that's option 1. That's the easy option. If you've got an accountant or a controller that you trust, that's great. Let's suppose you don't, or maybe you try that and it really just doesn't work. Option 2 is probably the more common option, frankly, where performance-based companies will lie. So you're talking like private equity-backed Fortune 100. They're not usually going to elevate a controller into a pure CFO or finance role. What they will do is they will hire an industry expert financial professional into the role to do it, often on a part-time or fractional basis, or just on a time-bound sort of sprint basis where they need to build out the infrastructure and then hand it off to the controller. There's a bunch of different ways you can do this, but generally the idea is they're going to hire somebody external that's just kind of been there, done that. They've done it before. What you get with that is you get faster implementation, right? The person's walking in with their playbook, their operating model for how to do this. Like they know what finance looks like at the highest levels. It's faster. They've got that pattern recognition, especially in your industry. Every industry is just slightly different. It's different enough to where if you plug in an industry CFO or an industry finance professional, they're going to know immediately what to do in your business, which is just kind of a breath of fresh air instead of you having to coach your accountant on doing that. And then third, there's just less trial and error. There's just less feedback. So again, if you really like your accountant or your controller, elevate them, coach them. If you're really good at coaching, you're really passionate about that, option 1's a great route. If you're not, or you don't like that, or you really want solutions fast, option 2, which is bringing in an external consultant, is probably the best way to go for you. So in conclusion, the best thing that you can do as a business is identify which type of finance you are leveraging. Is it finance as a service provider, or is it finance as a strategic partner? And what are you comfortable with? Are you struggling? Because if you're not losing sleep and not missing out on major decisions, and you're in type 1 as a service provider, that's fine. Stay there until you feel it break. But like I mentioned before, you're going to feel it start to break down. That accountability that you spread, you're going to start to feel too distant. You're going to start to lose touch of the business. That's where you insert finance as a service or as a strategic partner. And that's where you can start to make a difference in your business.